Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm so pleased to welcome you to Alfanar's first webinar of 2021, the year when things get better. Please save the date for our next webinar on the 4th of March. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists, Caroline Fines, the CEO of Giving Evidence, and Peter Greer, the CEO of Hope International. They are so gracious and so generous to share their time and experience with us here today, and we are so grateful to have them here. I want to welcome our investees in Lebanon and Egypt. Thank you so much for being here. This is all for you and the communities that you serve. And I want to welcome our board and supporters and everyone who has joined today, even if you've never heard of Alfanar. I'm going to introduce you to our executive director in a little bit to also give you a quick word of welcome. But before, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and what this webinar is all about. So my name is Teresa Shaheen, and I'm a senior lecturer in social entrepreneurship at the Yale School of Management. I am also very proud to be the innovation advisor for Alfanar Venture Philanthropy, the first and only venture philanthropy organization in the Arab region. Alfanar is an apolitical, a-religious organization serving social entrepreneurs, supporting social entrepreneurs from all backgrounds who serve everyone. And this webinar was catalyzed by our country director, Michel Mraade in Lebanon, who has experienced so much since the Beirut blast of August 4, and who felt that the experiences of social entrepreneurs and the funding community in this time of double and triple crises can resonate and help social entrepreneurs and funders working in other countries that Alfanar works in, including Egypt and Jordan, countries where our funders and supporters live, including the UK, the US, and all around the world. And we are delighted to have 100 participants almost from around the world today joining us. And we hope to have the opportunity to learn about your work in the future. But I know that you're here to hear from Caroline and Peter, so I've said everything I want to say. And Mirna, if you could just share with the audience a little bit about the host organization of this webinar before we get started.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for your time and for moderating this discussion and for all your support over the years. You are our founding director in Lebanon, and so we are incredibly grateful for everything you do for us, and to Caroline and Peter for your generosity. I am Mirna Atallah, the Executive Director of Alfanar, and I'm thrilled that so many of you have joined us. For those who don't know us, Alfanar means beacon in Arabic, and we are the Arab region's first venture philanthropy organization. We serve essentially as a platform for individual donors, for corporate partners, for other foundations and institutions who share the vision that we can together pool our capital and our resources to bring about long-term sustainable change in education, employment, and economic empowerment for vulnerable communities across the Arab world. And we do this specifically by investing in social enterprises, as Teresa mentioned, in Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and refugee communities. And we focus on social enterprises because they are essentially responding to a market failure using business models and tools, and there's a hope for sustainability in the long run. We provide tailored funding, management support, training, access to networks, and to business intelligence technology to help social entrepreneurs track their impact in real time. I want to just say thank you to the over 600 donors who stood by us. Last year was an incredibly difficult year, and we were able to deliver over 9,000 hours of management support to 17 social enterprises and further training to 70, and to positively improve the lives of over 53,000 women, youth, and children. And on average, despite the difficulty of the year, our social entrepreneurs recovered 55% of their costs through self-generated revenue. But anyhow, you can learn more at alfanar.org. Our 2020 impact report is up, and I'm really excited about today's discussion because the questions that Caroline and Peter will be covering are questions we ask ourselves every day when we're looking at how to make smart, intelligent, strategic social investment decisions. And I encourage everyone to ask lots of questions. So without further ado, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mirna. All right, so we're going to start by asking Caroline and Peter to share a little bit about their work. They've prepared short presentations to highlight two key challenges that our investees have been facing on the ground during these times of multiple crises. And those two key challenges are overhead and mission drift. So Caroline, I'll ask you to go first, please, if you could share your slides and tell us what your work has taught you about these topics.
Yeah, thank you. So, Marhaba, it's always great to be speaking with people in the region. I wish that we were there today, but unfortunately, the times do not allow. That's really a shame. So my organization, Giving Evidence, we work with donors, in many countries and on many issues, and have done for many years. And we work on helping them to use evidence to become as effective as they possibly can, so to make as big a difference with the resources as they can. One issue that comes up a lot, which is the issue I'm going to talk about, which is about overheads and administrative costs. So really, really often donors think that they should give to, that a clever thing to do is to give to organizations that have low administrative costs. And I think, and it's really a very false notion and very damaging. And I think what is going on here is that people have a notion that on this diagram on the left, can you see this, Teresa? Can you see this now? Yeah. That what is going on in a charity is it's like a pipe, and you put money in at one end and it comes out at the other end to the beneficiary. And that what the charity does is to basically take away money from your donation. So that, you know, you put in $100 and maybe only $80 kind of makes it to the end of the pipe, and the $20 gets kind of wasted along the way. And this, in my experience, is absolutely not a good model. That's not really what happens. That the model of what good charities are doing is much more like what's happening on the right-hand side of this diagram, where you put in your money, and then as a donor, and then actually the charity is able to add value to that through having local knowledge, through having experience elsewhere, so it knows more than you do. It brings in volunteers. Sometimes it can get bulk discounts and economies of scale and things like that, so that actually the £100 that you put in is able to achieve more because it has gone through the charity than if you simply just, you know, put $100 in the post and sent it. Okay, so a good charity adds value to your donation. There is waste in charities, of course there is. There's waste in any organization, but it's not clearly labeled as such in the accounts. So it's a very weird nudge, I think, that in some countries, my own included, charities are required in their annual accounts to talk about the amount that gets spent on administration or on fundraising or on governance, as though these are somehow separate from the real work. And it's just not true. It's also not true empirically. So Giving Evidence did the first empirical analysis that anybody had ever done in the world. We did this a few years ago. And what we wanted to do is to look at, actually, if you look at charities and you compare them on how good they are, so how effective they are, what do we learn about that in terms of the amount that they spend on administrative costs? So we looked at, I don't know if you're familiar with GiveWell, which is a US organization, an independent organization that does rankings of charities. These data are from 2009, because that was when we did it, and they stopped doing their rankings in a way that enables this analysis more recently. But at the time, they had rated loads of organizations. Many of them they didn't recommend at all. Some they called notable, some they called silver, and some they called gold. And we just simply looked up how much do those organizations spend in their administrative expenses. And you can see here the answer is that the ones that are gold, the highest performing organizations, spend more on administrative costs than those that are silver. Those that are silver spend more than those that are notable, and those that are notable spend more than those that they have analyzed and don't look at all. So what this is telling us, it's not a massive sample size, but what it's telling us is that higher performing charities spend more on administrative costs than lower performing charities. So actually, if you are a donor and you are selecting charities based on how little they spend on overheads, it's a false economy. So you are encouraging them to not do a very good job. And in a way, you know, we see part of that from this diagram before. You're encouraging them not to be able to add all those parts that are there on the right-hand side. You know, doing all of that can consume some resource. This is a way of thinking about the issue in terms of the maths. So because sometimes we think about, you know, a charity spends 20% of its total costs on administrative costs. And this is about looking at, well, 20% of what? So suppose that you have two charities that are sending drugs. Let's say they're buying the vaccine. This example is from before this current crisis, but they're sending the vaccine, or they're sending, you know, anti-malarial drugs or whatever. The drugs cost, maybe there's one organization which is spending, there's two organizations and they both spend $1,000 on administration, but one charity has a really great procurement process and they're able to buy their drugs for just $1,000, whereas the other one has a terrible procurement process and its drugs it's getting them really expensively for $10,000. Well, they're both spending the same amount on administration, but if we look at the admin cost as a proportion of the total, you can see that the cheap program is spending half of its costs on admin. That's because the drugs are only costing it $1,000, whereas the more expensive program is spending $10,000 on drugs. So its total program is costing $11,000, and therefore its administrative spend looks like it's smaller. It's a smaller proportion, but of a much bigger cost. So here, if you are choosing charities based simply on them having a low proportion that they spend on administration or on overhead, then you're encouraging them to be massively inefficient, to spend 10 times more than they need to. You're encouraging them and rewarding them for having a terrible procurement process. So this is about just asking, well, a proportion of what? So in a way, the whole thing about administrative costs and judging charities based on how much they spend on admin costs, it's fixing the wrong problem, like this lady is doing here. That what we need to focus on is how effective the organization is. So whether it's serving a need that is really there, whether it's serving a need that the intended beneficiaries prioritize, and whether it has a good system for doing that, whether its intervention really works. We're interested in what comes out of the end of the pipe. We're not so interested in kind of how the pipe works. If an organization has an intervention that doesn't work or is harmful, which some do, it doesn't matter how little they spend on administration. The fact is they've got an intervention that's harmful. So it always seems to me that with administrative costs, we are in danger of fixing the wrong problem, and it's a false economy kind of problem. And I know that it can be really tempting to, and I think there has been some of this in the Lebanon context post the explosion, it can be really tempting to try to fund organizations that use volunteers rather than experts. And in fact, what that does is it means that you have people who are not expert at doing a job that really requires experts, and that can be really a false economy.
Caroline, what you have said resonates so much, both your point about volunteers in the recent crises, and even before that. You know, what our investees are trying to do is shift away from the charity mindset and more towards the social enterprise mindset, where admin is management. It's people actually doing the work and creating the impact. So of course you should support those people. And it's been difficult to change the mindset of donors, because donors and funders have been in that charity mindset for so long. And there's a misconception that if you're giving $1 and 100% of that dollar goes straight to the beneficiaries, then that dollar is making more of a difference. But that's charity. That's just giving your money to beneficiaries.
Well, it's not a difference between charity and social enterprise. It's actually nothing to do with that, in my view. But it is it's about inputs versus outcomes. So
exactly, and it's about
simply on how the money gets spent. You cannot tell the impact that an intervention has by looking at a breakdown of the costs.
Exactly. And if you are trying to change the status quo and really transform a sector, you need to invest in management, and that is how you will get impact. And so you really need to shift away from that charity mindset. Thank you so much. And I know that our attendees have a lot of questions for you, so feel free to type your questions into the Q&A, and I'll invite Peter to share his slides as well. Thank you so much, Caroline.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you, Caroline. That was terrific, and looking forward to the conversation with all of you. And I just want to say to Alfanar, thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you've been doing. And especially in this last year when it has been challenge after challenge after challenge. Thank you for continuing to show up. And I thought about this question about mission drift and about overhead and collaboration in light of what happened on August 4th in Beirut. And it brought me back to a time earlier in my career. I was living in Rwanda, and across the border in Goma, Mount Nyiragongo erupted. I was doing microenterprise development in Rwanda. That's the sector that I've been involved with, and my current work with Hope International is about financial inclusion and savings groups and economic development. And yet, because of the proximity, I was asked to go and figure out how we could respond to this humanitarian crisis. And at the time, I did not have a background in this type of assistance. I did not know what I was doing. I remember my wife and I packed our tent and our sleeping bags and filled our car with water and what we had, and we drove to the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and were tasked with an assignment: go help. That assignment was a pretty complex assignment. Initially, we were working in one area, and we noticed that individuals were cold, and we were in this area where there were a number of different refugees that had fled the slow-moving lava of Mount Nyiragongo. And as we were there, we thought people are cold. It was the rainy season. And so we thought, let's buy blankets. And so we went and locally bought some blankets and were about ready to give them away when another organization, another nonprofit organization came to us that was operating in the same region. And they said, Peter, you can't give away your blankets. And I remember being a little bit surprised. It seemed to me people are cold and we have something that might just provide a little bit of temporary relief. Let's do this. And it turns out that the reason they didn't want these blankets to be distributed were because there was a news crew that was coming from CNN, and they thought that it would not look as good if individuals, when they showed up, had this provision. I was confused by that. I was deeply confused, because it sure seemed to me that they were using individuals in a moment of need to tell their story as an organization. And it was an undermining, it was a sabotaging, it was a false and hypocritical expression of love and compassion in a moment of need. And that did not sit well with me. Throughout my career, I have realized that there have been times when I have done the exact same thing, though. So I am not just putting throwing those other organizations under the bus. I know that I've had that same posture where it's been about my story and about the work that we're doing. But I have come to realize that this question about how we approach our work, it really matters. And I've also come to realize that when we do this work, whenever we focus on our story or our organization or our mission, we are missing out on a bigger and better story. We're missing out on the very purpose and reason why we exist. In this refugee camp, in this moment, I was so impacted by some friends at the Croix Rouge, at the Red Cross, and a very different approach. What they ended up doing was realizing that there were some blankets that would help. They had a far better system of distribution. They had a far better system. And they did something crazy. They said, let's do this together. Let's figure out how we can serve together, how we can find a way of making an impact together. And their process was one that was so rooted. It wasn't seeing the work that we were doing as threatening. It was an opportunity for us to do something together in that moment. And I think about that paradigm and the difference that we saw in that. And a real simple 2x2, I think for all of us, the question for us is whether or not we focus primarily about what's the mission that we have, the ultimate mission, or do we slip into small thinking that ends at the end of our organizational boundaries? Do we believe that there is a mission that extends beyond that we're part of that would actually be impossible for us to achieve on our own? Are we invited into a bigger mission beyond the smaller story of organizational impact that we're telling? And the similar question, do we believe in a world of abundance, or do we slip into scarcity mindset, this belief that there's not enough? And the other organization believed that there's not enough attention to go around, so I'm going to get everything I can have. And while in some ways we might know and we might accept this within private sector, but even there I believe it's being challenged. I believe that there's this invitation to say, we've got to think bigger. We've got to think beyond a scarcity mindset. And I believe that upper right-hand quadrant is where I want to live. I want to spend time, and even this with all of you, I love the opportunity to connect with other organizations doing good work and say, what are the things that we could do together that would be absolutely impossible to achieve on our own? I think about the most exciting work that we are a part of right now is Hope International. The work that we've done over the last 10 years was developing some tools, training materials for church-based savings groups. They've been growing rapidly. I believe that this is an intervention that has a lot of potential for continued impact in the years to come as groups gather together and save and invest. But we realize that our impact is always going to be limited. And so in relationship, in partnership, there's a number of other organizations. This is a picture of Salvation Army and Hope International Partnership, where we simply said, we don't want to be the bottleneck. We don't want to be the constraining resource. So let's give everything away. Let's give everything away in the models, the methodology, because the goal is not to advance Hope International. The goal is the ending of extreme poverty in our lifetime. And if this is a tool, it would be an unwise allocation of time, talent, and resources for us to hold on to something that might be beneficial to other organizations. So we've dramatically changed, gone to an open source approach. We believe in collective impact and different interventions. And I believe the real exciting work that's happening now and is going to continue is when it is thinking, it is goal setting, it is something that says we want to be part of something bigger and better and more impactful that would be impossible for us as an organization to achieve on our own. I know I only had 5 minutes, but these are topics that I care about. I wrote a couple books on these themes and would love to see where the conversation goes in the questions.
Thank you so much, Peter. We are already getting questions from the audience, so I'm only going to ask one question and then we'll shift over to them. And you've both spoken about operations in the time of crises, and one thing that I know that our investees have really struggled with is, how do you differentiate between adaptation and mission drift, especially in times of crises? You need to be responsive, you need to be agile and flexible. But so when does that become mission drift, and how do you manage that?
Do you want to go first, or shall I? Well, I mean, it seems I'm going to give a slightly theoretical answer, and then I'm going to give an example. So, I mean, it becomes mission drift if your mission changes. And to my view, it's adaptation if you are just changing what you're doing, but with, broadly the same goal. So for instance, this is not a crisis example, but there is, so here's an easy example. There is an organization here in the UK which does mentoring for at-risk teenagers, okay? And they are trying to encourage them to stay in school and to get educational results and to, get on a good life path and not to get involved in the bad stuff that teenagers can get involved in. And so they did some analysis of their work, and they discovered that it's much easier to get people to be mentors who are women. And there's a mix in the mentees and a mix of sexes. And they discovered that boys do much better if they are mentored by a man. Okay, the outcomes are better. And so they can adapt that. That's like a small adaptation that they can do. They can deliberately go out and try to match the male mentors that they've got with the boys. They can try to get more male mentors. That's an adaptation in my view, but it's designed to improve the performance. By the way, this is a very intelligent use of monitoring. So really, really often, as you know, monitoring that charities and social enterprises do is basically a waste of time, and it's just compliance and tick boxing, and nobody is really learning from it. And I really like this example because it's a really simple thing they learn that's really actionable. So that's an example, I think, of adaptation. Another example is, again, here in the UK, we have an organization called the Education Endowment Foundation. They are tasked with improving educational attainment across the whole country. And they run masses of research to figure out what is effective, and they compile the existing research and they provide that to teachers and schools, and by the way, also parents, and they help teachers and schools and parents to implement the evidence-based recommendations. And so they have had to, like everybody, completely pivot their work during this time of crisis when schools have been shut and children have been schooling at home, some doing all right, some doing terribly. And so they have been re-looking at all the existing information that is in the world about, what do we know about remote learning? How can we do it well, for example? How can we continue in our mission of helping teachers and schools and parents to get the best education for their children, but given that we have a completely different context now. It's not about classroom management anymore, right? It's, and it's not about, it's just everything has changed. So they are, the mission is absolutely the same, but the means that they have to use to go about it and the kind of operational questions have to change completely, but they have the still basic approach of finding the research, generating new research where we don't have it, and helping teachers and schools to get hold of that research and understand its implications.
That is a good way of looking at it. How can we continue in our mission in this new context? And that is a way of being adaptive and agile without mission drift. Thank you so much, Caroline. Peter, any thoughts would you like to add?
Yeah, and I thought, Caroline, that those words that you used are just, those two just stood out to me as well, but mission and means, and to have the ability to articulate and to differentiate those two. And if you want to avoid mission drift, that begins with an assumption that you know what your mission is. So a small number of things that you say are the very core of who we are, the very fabric, the very reason why we exist. I really appreciate some of Simon Sinek's work about your why and understanding that. Why do you exist? What is the very core purpose? But then I think, especially in light of last year, the word that I've heard so many times is pivot. Does anyone else feel like we've pivoted so many times that we're dizzy? Does anyone feel like
I feel
we just
dizzy.
have spun around so many times? And I think in a moment of crisis, it becomes even more difficult to say, what is our mission when we're dizzy, when we're pivoting? And the just one word I would say on this is intentionality. The word drift is this word, you think about a current on a stream or somehow that oftentimes you don't pay attention to until you look up and you see just how far you have gone from a starting point. I love that word drift in this conversation because it's slow, it's subtle, it's unintentional. And so if you want to avoid drift, It's the opposite of that. It's active, it's intentional. It's saying we're going to make decisions in light of our mission. And if it does not help us accomplish our mission, it might be a good activity. But again, if we have this posture of open-handedness and abundance, that gives us freedom to say, point people to that other organization that's doing great work. I don't have to do it. It might be really good work, but if it doesn't fit within our mission, within our expertise, let's give it away to someone else. And so clarity of mission and then intentionality of practice to make decisions about the means in light of who we are as organizations.
I really agree with that. And I also think that it's fine to change your mission. If the priorities in the world change, it's fine to change your mission. But I agree with what Peter says, that, you know, logs float down rivers. You know, the river does that work. The log does not decide to do that. But it's about intentional. So if you, I mean, it's like if the facts change, I change my mind. You know, if the circumstances change, your priorities might very well change. You know, if you were operating in Sri Lanka and you were running an education program, say, and then there was the Boxing Day tsunami, you might decide that education doesn't matter this week. What matters is getting everybody into homes and clean water and fed, right? And that's absolutely an intentional decision, and that seems to me extremely sensible response to this. And so many organizations have obviously had to do that in the last year, because circumstances just are completely different. I've had donors do it. That you change your priorities because the world has changed.
I think intentionality is very important, as you both underscored. And I like the way you put it, Peter, in terms of operating from a mindset of abundance instead of scarcity. And that will help you, even within an immediate crisis, keep a long-term view and think about how you can achieve more collectively and collaboratively. I think that's really important. We have a question on management costs from Asma Kamil. How can we justify our management costs or admin costs to donors? Is there a different kind of costs breakdown that could help? So I guess, Caroline, maybe you could take that first.
Yeah, I in fact wrote an entire book about this once. I think that, well, there's a couple of things going on here. One is that it's sort of the wrong conversation to be in. So you really want to be having a conversation about the outcomes that you are creating. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can share something with you now. This is a graph of how good various organizations, I'm sorry, this is all UK example, and that's quite unusual for me, but this is how good various UK charities are at reducing reoffending. Can you see this?
Yes.
And the ones at the top, those programs seem to increase reoffending, they seem to increase harm. Whereas these ones at the bottom are all decreasing reoffending, so they are decreasing crime. And you can see there's a massive variation at how effective they are in decreasing crime. Okay, so this one up here, the top one here, might only be decreasing crime by about 3 percentage points, whereas this one here is by about 22 percentage points. So this is a conversation about outcomes and results. It is not a conversation about cost structure. You know, if Amber Life spends a load of its money on shoes and handbags, like, I don't care, because the fact is that it's doing an amazing job. Even if it is, you know, just like wasting money, then it's still doing an amazing job. And I have zero interest in the cost structure of these organizations up here, because their intervention is not working. Okay, so if we can get away from a conversation that's about inputs and cost structures to a much more productive conversation that's about outcomes and how effective we are, that is really like a first massive step. And the other thing I think then is to talk about what you are doing in those management costs. So for instance, one of the things that I see charities doing, and again, I would not distinguish between charities and social enterprises, is they spend time learning from one part of the organization and taking that knowledge to another part of the organization. Well, that seems pretty sensible, right? Or they spend time and money looking at the existing literature to see what can we learn from that. I know there's somebody from JPAL on, for example, very serious research producers, good operational organizations look at the existing literature to see what can we learn from that we can apply to our own work. Well, that's kind of a management cost. That's not like literally handing out soup in a soup kitchen. That's part of what the management thing is. Putting together collaborations, doing the kind of analysis that I talked about to establish that boys do better with male mentors than with female mentors. I mean, this is all work, right? I think if we can firstly try and get out of a conversation about cost structure and onto outcomes, and secondly, if pushed on the cost structure, just explain how it relates to improving your effectiveness and improving the outcomes. That is, that it's not waste.
I think one thing I'm hearing from what you're saying is that social enterprises need to get better at demonstrating their impact. And I think that impact metrics is something that we can all work on. And I do think that funders respond to data, and I do think that it's challenging to invest time in developing impact metrics, but it sounds like it's an investment worth making, even during times of crisis, because you have to demonstrate your impact and your outcomes to shift the conversation away from how much does this cost to what difference is it making. Peter, is there anything you wanted to add?
Nope. Caroline, that was so well said.
Okay, great. So one thing that you brought up, Caroline, was learning from each other and learning from the literature. And I wonder whether you could each share with us a little bit about the struggle between responding and innovating, because learning and adapting is innovation. And so how can we learn from each other? How can the grassroots organizations on the ground learn from each other during times of crisis when they're so busy responding and adapting? How can you give us examples that you've seen from your work on how grassroots organizations have succeeded in creating this learning environment to foster innovation? Maybe Peter, you can take this one first.
Yeah, it brings to mind, there's a Burundian proverb that says you'll never make it through the dry season on your own. And that is truth right there. And I think we've all experienced that over the last year in particular. But the question is, how do we do that? How do we make sure that there is time? And everything that I do within my realm of economic development, it really has a community base to it. And initially, I thought it was about capital mobilization. I thought it was about the financial services. And I've come to realize the strengthening social capital, the strengthening relationships, that is every bit as significant as some of the financial interventions as well. And I believe that's true for all of us. In our lives, we probably know that. You remember the friends who show up when you're in a moment of need. So I think all that to say is I think it starts with our belief. Do we actually believe we need each other? Do we actually believe we're better off? And then the second question is, if we do, then does our calendar reflect that? And if you're spending all of your time internal to an organization, all of your time focused on just your colleagues and not having any fresh ideas, not having any interaction, I think you're missing out on not only an incredible gift to you to have colleagues and friends to walk alongside, but also for the advancement of new ideas and innovations. Why is it that cities historically that were at the crossroads of trade routes developed more innovations over time? Why is that? Well, because new ideas came through and they were able to take, and that's significant. So I would just say, do we believe in it? And then do we believe it enough that it impacts our time allocation? And just personally, my time, fighting for that time to interact with other organizations in similar spaces has been so life-giving, friendship and insight and expertise. So I would just say, if you believe it matters, does your calendar reflect that belief?
Caroline, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I mean, in a way, it's the same, it's very analogous actually to the conversation about administrative costs, because you can see these conversations between organizations. You know, when the house is on fire, it feels like, you know, having a conversation with people in other organizations is a is like an overhead cost. It's a kind of an optional extra that you could get rid of. And I think what Peter is suggesting is that that's a false economy to do so, right? Because maybe somebody else, they figured out how to put out your type of fire better. I see a very interesting example in Africa. So there is a, well, actually it's not just in Africa, mainly in Africa. Pratham, which is one of the world's biggest NGOs, invented the annual Status of Education report. Well, and they also invented a remedial education program called Teaching at the Right Level. Actually, and JPAL was very involved in that. And that started in India, and it's been rolled out in many other countries, many in sub-Saharan Africa, but also elsewhere. And there is a network of organizations who run that remedial education program. It's called the People's Action Learning Network. And they have been really active this year because, of course, many countries have suddenly had a massive education crisis, and they've suddenly had, as I was saying before, you know, children all out of school, and you know, and obviously not all children having laptops and unstable internet connections and so on. And so they have done a ton of work on helping their member organizations who run these kinds of programs to adapt to the current circumstance. So in one Young Love, for example, in Botswana, has been delivering lessons by radio, you know, just completely different to what anybody would have dreamt of, you know, 13 months ago. And that idea and some of those materials can just be taken and translated and used, and you don't have to do any innovating. You can just borrow it off somebody else, and so it can you know, save time and increase effectiveness really rapidly.
And I appreciate the education examples because many of our investees do work in education and mentorship, so this definitely resonates. I'll take one more question from Amal Karake. From your experience, what were the main challenges you had to deal with to establish sustainable partnerships with national governments? Speaking of really transforming the status quo and not just applying band-aids, if we're going to make sustainable long-term change, doesn't that require sustainable partnerships with national governments? And what were some of the challenges and perhaps some of the success stories that you could share with us about that from your work?
Oh, well, actually, I'm just starting a massive study of partnerships between research producing organizations and partnerships and governments. And they are quite well studied. I mean, there are many types of them. So there are partnerships, I'm not quite sure what the question is about, but there are partnerships that are around production and use of data and evidence. Those are the ones that I know about more than the delivery ones.
Okay.
And there are many types of those, from you know, is the goal to increase demand amongst policymakers for data and evidence? Is it to increase, to actually do the production, or is it about increasing the state's capacity to produce this information themselves? And you know, what kind of data and evidence are we talking about? Like just data, like how many children are there, how much rainforest is there, you know, how many clinics are there, through to, you know, process evaluation or impact evaluation. So there's a whole massive smorgasbord of them. So I don't know how to answer this question in the kind of general way.
Okay, fair enough. Peter, any advice on establishing sustainable partnerships with national governments?
Yeah, I mean, my thought goes to just the importance of constituent mapping and understanding with especially nonprofit leaders when time always feels in short supply. Sometimes we can miss out on understanding, listening to all of the various constituencies, and government is a critical one. I think there's been a lot of time where in some contexts that I've been in, the government, you kind of try to hold them at arm's length, and you try to do your work and just please don't let the, you know, intervention come that feels distracting. And I think that's actually missing out on an opportunity and missing out on a much more sustainable path, which is understand your constituents, spend time in communication with them. And if you're operating as an organization that is doing good work within a community or context, why would you not want to share that with your government leader? So I would just say the intentionality and the relationship mapping is a very helpful exercise, and our approach and posture and the assumption of positive intent that we actually are in line, in alignment with some of the things that we're trying to do. So don't keep them at arm's length. Figure out what information would be helpful, what reports would they like, and do the radical work of listening and asking good questions about how you can support and how you can do this work together. So I don't know, I feel like sometimes within the nonprofit community that I'm a part of, government is held at arm's length, and I think that misses and in some ways falsely characterizes the positive alignment and the positive intent that oftentimes is shared between those two.
Okay, so it sounds, Amma, like sharing information and collecting data is a pathway that came out of both panelists in terms of building those relationships with government. Where can you add value to them? And I'm going to squeeze in one last question from an investee, Samir Sfir, saying that a number of social enterprises in the Arab region have proved their impact and efficiency, going back to what we were saying a few minutes earlier about impact metrics and about adding value. Yet we still see that the majority of donor agencies' conditions for large funds deployed to social enterprises in the Arab region require international presence and previous work in large funds. Rather than investing directly in a grassroots organization, they want to see a larger international organization that has worked with huge funds in the past. And so this narrows down the pool of applicants for those funds to international NGOs and development agencies rather than going directly to social enterprises. How can this evolve into having more faith in local and regional social enterprises that can achieve a lot of impact, especially in times of crisis? So how can we, do you have any advice for social enterprises and organizations supporting them in helping to shift this focus from organizations with international presence who have previously managed large funds and shift it to supporting social enterprises with a demonstrated impact in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the problem. So the problem is that, you know, so a big funder like, I don't know, USAID or or one of the big international funders, is the problem this, that the big funders want to fund an international NGO, even if it on grants to in-country organizations, they don't want to fund the in-country organizations directly. Is that the problem?
Yeah, even if a social enterprise has demonstrated impact, but you know, they are a Lebanese social enterprise and they've never worked with millions of dollars in grants or in other countries. So a multilateral might be more likely to give to Oxfam, for example. That's just an example. So how can we shift this this mindset and this practice to directly supporting social enterprises with demonstrated impact, even if they're national, local, or regional, rather than the international NGOs?
So I have a few thoughts about that. I mean, firstly, I don't really know, because I don't really know where that behavior comes from. I did do a big study of UK funders of international development, i.e. things outside the UK, basically outside Western Europe, several years ago, and there was a lot of discussion about risk. You know, oh, we don't know what's going on. We don't know these organizations. They have different names to us. They're a long way away. You know, it's all a bit scary. And so I think often the reason that particularly foreign money wants to go through, like UK money might want to go through a UK-based organization, is because it seems like it's lower risk. Okay, that's partly about the regulatory structure. So, you know, if you are a UK foundation, then you give to Oxfam. Oxfam is based in the UK. It's under the UK charity regulator. You know, then you've like discharged your responsibility sensibly. Like if something horrible then happens, it's kind of Oxfam's problem rather than yours. So I think there's something of that. I genuinely don't know how to get rid of that problem. But it may, but then also I remember people saying, well, is this actually not so different to funding in other parts of the country? If you're based in London, then the north of Scotland is quite a long way away. You probably don't go there very often. It's quicker to get to Beirut than it is to get to the north of Scotland, or it was before all this. And so actually it's a kind of similar thing. So we did that project as part of like advocacy to encourage more foundations to fund internationally, you know, for precisely this reason. The other thing is about the role of intermediaries. So actually organizations like Alfanar can be very relevant in that, because what I think is going on is that the funders are not necessarily looking for organizations based in their own country, but they're looking for an organization that's safe. They're looking for a kind of safe passage, low risk passage. And so, you know, if intermediaries based in the region like Alfanar, if they can be that partner and be the intermediary, and to know what's happening on the ground, to know about reputations and reliability, to know about the local context, that can be a really valuable service.
Yeah, just that is so good. I think the question that the question prompts is, so we've had this conversation. Teresa, I feel like this is a future conversation. Don't listen to the two of us. Bring the funders on. Ask them what their thoughts and approach are, and I think that would be a pretty fascinating one. And I'd love to listen in on that as well.
I'm on the hot seat.
But I do think so. Within the just experience that I've had, and we don't get government funds. We are privately funded, but I think about trust is the currency. Trust in that is what matters in the work that we do, and you cannot lose trust, and trust is not microwavable. Trust takes time, it takes relationship. And so I would just say, as you're thinking about this, have a real clear theory of change. What is it that your social enterprise, like what is it that you believe you are doing that is contributing to this positive impact? Two, as Caroline has so eloquently said, measurement matters. You've got to invest in something and understanding, even if it's imperfect, what is the way that you're approaching your theory of change, and then what you measure. And then the third is, do you have plans? Do you have ideas about what you're going? And if there's clarity around that, plus the final ingredient that is so important is just don't lose hope. Like, don't give up. Just because there's a couple doors that are going to be shut, there's a lot more people that are going to be ready to listen and engage. And I don't know what the ratio is for you. I know personally it's probably 1 to 100, that I will have 100 conversations before having that one that reminds me why I do. And there is alignment, and there's this excitement. And so I would just say, articulate your theory of change, figure out what you measure, that matters, figure out your plans for the future, and then don't lose hope in continuing to share that message. And eventually there's going to be a whole lot of joy and excitement when in trust there's this relationship and you can be partners in this work, no longer just organization and investor, but true partners in this work, doing something together that both of you could not do on your own. And I think that is the that's where the exciting work happens, when it truly is in partnership, doing something that no one of us could do on our own.
Thank you so much, Peter and Caroline. I do think that that is the perfect point for me to stop and reflect a little bit and synthesize and summarize some of the key themes that emerged from this conversation. These are huge issues that it would be difficult to get bite-sized answers to in an hour's conversation, and many of them don't have clear answers. But the first step is coming together and talking about them. And so I want to thank everybody who came here today to share their questions and to share their wisdoms. And apologies to Vivian, Constantin, and Bob if I didn't get to your questions. But please do tweet the panelists, tweet Alfanar. We are here for you and we want to keep this conversation going. Some of the key themes that I heard emerging from this conversation today, one of the ones that really keeps popping up is really strength in numbers. Talk to each other. This is a moment of panic where social enterprises are feeling unheard and are feeling small relative to the scale of the crisis and the scale of other organizations, and especially multilateral and international NGOs. Talk to each other. Can you exchange data with each other to demonstrate the value that you're adding collectively? And both to the government, going back to one of the questions that we got, and to funders, and to each other in order to increase your impact. How can you have not only collective impact through your own direct programs, but also through advocacy? Can we come together to advocate for some of these changes that we're asking for? I know, for example, that Samer was one of the founders of the Lebanese Social Enterprise Association, and that's one of the things that this association means to do, is to bring social entrepreneurs together for collective impact and advocacy. I think that exchanging data, talking to each other, can help build trust and partnerships, which is something that Peter mentioned, and which is something that my own research has shown, that in order to have any types of partnerships, especially public-private partnerships, there are certain things that you can do that builds trust, and I'm happy to share those results with you online. And also keep in time that this takes time. It's all about building relationships with each other, with the government, and with funders. And even though we need to respond quickly to crises, we need to build relationships over a long period of time. And that needs to be ongoing. And so I think one of the main things I want to say to our investees and all our participants and to funders is that while we are responding to urgent needs, we also want to keep a long-term mindset and remember that it's all about investing in relationships and working together and looking at the data that's coming out of the ground. And measurement is a huge part of that, being clear on each organization's theory of change. And yes, having a plan. And Alfanar can help with that. Please get in touch with us on social media, get in touch with the speakers. There are so many ways to get involved in this community. We do need to close in the next minute, but we'll share a slide on ways to get in touch, on ways to get involved. And thank you again so much, everyone, for joining. Please stay in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Caroline and Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. It's been great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining, and thanks even to those who joined late. It was wonderful to see all your names in the participant list. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the Alfanar team for organizing, to our board, donors, partners, and most importantly, investees. We're going to be closing now, but please take a look at the slide on ways to get involved, and let's keep the conversation going with the broader community on Twitter. Please feel free to email Alfanar, email myself, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much.